Good. My name is Vann Joines. I'm from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I'm a clinical psychologist and also a teaching and supervising transactional analyst. And want to welcome all of you to this two-day OneonOne course. The OneonOne course was developed by Eric Berne, who originated transactional analysis, as a basic overview of the theory and practice of transactional analysis. And in order to be official OneonOne course, it has to be taught by either a teaching and supervising transactional analyst or a provisional teaching and transactional analysis or a certified transactional analyst who's certified to teach OneonOne courses. So it's used as the basic first step in training, going on for further training. And there's some materials in your handout about that I'll talk about later if any of you are interested in pursuing further training in TA after this course. As you probably read in the announcements about the course, originally Josephine Lewis was supposed to teach this with me. And unfortunately, she had a heart attack on July 9th and passed away, which was a tremendous loss. She was a beautiful person, fantastic therapist, a dear friend. She was my co-therapist for 41 years. And so it's with a saddened heart that I share this information with you. I will miss her greatly. And I'd like to take just a moment of silence and invite you to do that with me just to remember Jo. Thank you. All right. I want to just tell you about the time schedule that we will be following. We'll be working from 9 until 5 each day and taking an hour and 15 minutes for lunch, and we can adjust that if we need more or less time. And we'll be taking breaks about every hour and a half for bathroom, coffee, whatever. I think it's difficult sometimes just to sit and listen to this much theory. So if you get tired or whatever and need to stretch, get up, move around, whatever, feel free to do that. This is a course that I've been teaching ever since I first became certified. It's still a favorite course of mine to teach. I'm increasingly impressed with Eric Berne's genius in taking very complex ideas and expressing them in very simple language. One of the things he was concerned about is the power differential that often exists in therapy between the therapist and the client, where the therapist is the expert with all the information and the client is kind of the peon who doesn't know anything. And Berne wanted to put therapist and client on equal foot so that they could work collaboratively, that the client could have the same information that the therapist or the consultant had in terms of the work that they were doing. And sometimes people misperceive the complexity of TA and the depth of TA because the language is so simple. It was designed for an ordinary 8-year-old child. As Berne said on one of his interviews, we found that in TA that we can express things in everyday ordinary English. And so that's what he attempted to do, was design a language and that has a lot of colloquial terms. Not all are still in use, but most of them are, so that the average person could easily understand the concepts. I have a training institute in Chapel Hill. And one of the nice things about having a training institute is you have people come through who do workshops in every imaginable approach to psychotherapy. And I'm still impressed with the clarity and the comprehensiveness and depth of TA as a basic psychological language to help work with people. And I think it's very useful in understanding other approaches to therapy because it is so clear. in my experience, is the best conceptual framework that I have found for really understanding what's going on with people. And I hope that you will have that experience too in these 2 days together. I want to just share a little bit with you about the history of transactional analysis. Transactional analysis was originally developed in the late 50s and early 60s by Eric Berne, a psychiatrist who was at that time living in Carmel, California. He had been trained as a Freudian analyst and was concerned with the complexity of the language, as I mentioned earlier, and wanted to really help people understand the concepts. His first book was called A Layman's Guide to Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis. Even before he began to write about transactional analysis, he was concerned with translating psychoanalytic concepts into ordinary, everyday English. Berne was originally born in 1910 in Montreal, Canada. He went to college and medical school at McGill University, and he came to the U.S. to do his psychiatric residency. He was drafted into the military and served as an Army psychiatrist. At the time he was drafted, he was in analysis with Paul Fettern, who is an ego psychologist. And I think from Fettern he first got some of the ideas about ego states. Fettern had talked about archaic states of personality, or the ego, the self, that are energized when we experience some stimulus in the present that is like something we experienced when we were little. For example, many of you may have had the experience of walking by a bakery and all of a sudden you're 8 years old on the streets of your hometown and, you know, remembering all those wonderful smells and tastes and so forth. We very quickly, given certain stimuli, will regress back to experiences in childhood. We move into what he called the child ego state. In 1958, Berne began the social psychiatry seminar in San Francisco. He also was practicing in Carmel, and he was consulting at Langley Porter Neuropsychic Institute in San Francisco. In 1962, Berne and his students in the seminar there began the TA Bulletin, began recording some of the ideas that they were developing for other people to learn about. In '64, Berne and his students formed the International Transactional Analysis Association, which now has associations in almost every major country worldwide. One of the exciting things about coming to a world conference is you have people from all over the world who are all using TA, using the same language, and come together and share ideas. And it's really exciting to see what people in other parts of the world are doing, and to exchange ideas, to have that kind of cross-fertilization. In 1970, Berne died of a massive heart attack, and the TA Bulletin was changed to the TA Journal in his honor. Berne was fascinated with the idea of intuition and wrote a series of papers on the nature of intuition. Part of his job as an Army psychiatrist was evaluating soldiers in terms of their mental health when they were about to be discharged. And he processed hundreds of soldiers a day, so it was fairly boring activity. So to entertain himself, he would play around with the idea of intuition. He would see how much he could tell about a soldier before he ever talked to them, when they were just waiting in line to be interviewed. And he found that he could pretty well determine what part of the country they were from, whether they were married or not, what their occupation was, and a number of other details before he ever talked to them. So what he began to experience is what a fantastic intuitive capacity most of us have to know things without exactly knowing how we know them. And he was very interested in that. As I mentioned earlier, wrote a series of 5 papers on the nature of intuition. It's now published in a little monograph, I think by Paul McCormick, on intuition and ego states. And he, in his training, really taught the people he was training to use their child ego state, what he called the little professor, the adult, ingenious, creative part of the child ego state. He often talked about thinking Martian. Said, you know, if you were a Martian who came down to the Earth and you didn't know the language and you didn't know what people were talking about, if you just watched them and were intuitively sensitive to what was going on, what would you think they were really saying or really attempting to do, and so on. And it's amazing how much in working with people that you can pick up on an intuitive level. He said the child knows more about, a 4-year-old child knows more about psychiatry than all the textbooks ever written. And unfortunately, as we grow, we are taught to use our grown-up adult ego state, and forget, our rational cognitive part of ourselves, and forget about that intuitive part in the child. But one of the things that helps us become very good in working with people, and especially in doing therapy, is to get back in touch with that intuitive capacity that we had as a very small child. I want to talk a little bit about some of the people who influenced Byrne. As I mentioned earlier, Paul Fettern was one of the early ego psychologists, and from Fettern, Byrne began to get the initial idea about ego states. One of his students, Eduardo Weiss, was one of the people who wrote a lot about Fettern's work and the whole concept of ego states, and how these get activated when we encounter some stimulus in the present that's like what we experienced early on. Another person who influenced Byrne, I think, is Erik Erikson. When Byrne finished his Army tour of duty, he was discharged. He was at Fort Ord, California, and he was discharged there and settled in Carmel and began analysis with Erik Erikson, who's probably most famous for his 8 psychosocial stages of human development. And I think from his work with Erikson, he began to get some of his ideas about the life script that he talked about later. Another important influence on Byrne was Wilder Penfield, who was a neurosurgeon investigating different parts of the brain. He was originally started out to try to discover the cause of focal epilepsy, which is having seizures in response to specific light patterns. And interestingly enough, Penfield never really found the part of the brain that was responsible for that, but he did some even more important things. He virtually mapped the entire cerebral cortex in terms of what part of the brain is responsible for what behavior or functioning. And he would drill holes in the brain, in the skull, and stimulate various parts of the brain. And one of the things he discovered, which was very fascinating, was when certain parts of the brain were stimulated, people would recall with vivid intensity experiences that they had had very early in their life. And they were as vivid as the original experience. And they would both see and heard what was said and done, and they would also feel and experience their reactions to it. And at the same time, they were aware that this was a re-experiencing, not the original. So Byrne used this information as validity for the existence of ego states. The parent ego state basically being the recording of what was seen and said and done, the child ego state being the recording of what the felt and understood experience was, and the adult being the part of the person who could really differentiate between the original experience and what they were experiencing at the moment. So he was a very important influence on Byrne. Let me just pause and say, if at any point you have questions or want more information, just stop me. And I think one of the advantages of taking a course like this over just reading this information in a textbook is a chance to ask questions and explore some of these ideas in more depth. So please feel free to do that as we go along. Another important influence on Byrne was Renee Spitz, who was a psychologist investigating infants who were left in what were called foundling homes, what we call orphanages, primarily in England. And one of the things Spitz was fascinated with is why in those situations some infants really thrive and do well, and while others fail to thrive and develop marasmus, and in extreme cases even die. Spitz initially thought, it must have something to do with the sterility of the conditions and those kinds of things. To his amazement, what he found was, in the homes where infants really thrived and did well, there were very nurturing caretakers who would pick these kids up and talk to them and play with them and handle them and interact with them, in addition to just changing their diapers and feeding them and those kinds of things. In the homes where infants failed to thrive and often developed illnesses and in extreme cases died, were homes where the caretakers simply changed their diapers, fed them, and nothing else. There was no interaction. And Byrne, from that, began to recognize how important stimulation and recognition is, and developed the whole idea of stroking that we'll talk more about later from Spitz's investigations. Another person I think had an important influence on Byrne, although Byrne never really talks about this, is Alfred Adler. Adler was a neo-Freudian. He was one of Freud's students who wrote a lot about what he called the life course. And it's very analogous to what Byrne talked about as the life script. And even though Byrne never exactly makes that connection in his work, because he was trained as an analyst, I can't help but think that Adler had a very important influence on Byrne's work on scripts. Because there are no other systems of psychotherapy that I have come across that has that concept of the whole idea of the life script, or a life course as Adler talked about it. And I think it's one of the most important contributions that Byrne made in his work. And I think Adler, who wrote about the life course prior to Byrne's work, certainly had some influence on him regarding life scripts. Wilfred Bion, who was a British analyst who worked a lot with groups, was a very important theorist on group therapy, and Byrne often refers to Bion's work in his own discussions of group psychotherapy. So he was another important figure that influenced Byrne in that way. And then, of course, Sigmund Freud. Byrne was originally trained as an analyst. He went through analysis, again, with both Paul Federin and also Erik Erikson. When he finished his analysis with Erikson, he applied for admission to the Psychoanalytic Institute in California. Initially, he was turned down. Nobody knows why. There's a lot of speculation. Byrne was kind of a maverick who was doing things in unique ways. For example, when he would do his work at Langley Porter Neuropsychic Institute, he would run groups of patients with the residents all around the outside observing. And then he would switch the two groups. He'd have the residents come on the inside and the patients observe the residents. So everybody was on equal footing. And he did, you know, a number of other things that were somewhat unique in the way that he worked, believing in the worth and value and dignity of every human being, and really promoting that in his work. So nobody knows if he was a little too radical for the Analytic Institute at that time or what the reasons were. He also made a decision to get married while he was in analysis, which is a no-no. But anyway, he was turned down originally. And he decided that he really didn't need psychoanalysis, that he would develop his own theory. And he developed about 90% of the theory of TA within about a 2-year period, which is an incredible achievement. His IQ was 180, around 180, so he was really in the genius category, and Mensa. And after he began teaching his ideas in his seminars, and he became very popular very quick. And after he began to get popular, the Psychoanalytic Institute invited him to join them, and he turned them down. So the one part of TA that he hadn't developed in those first 2 years was the information on life scripts. And some of his students, Claude Steiner mainly, did a lot of work in helping him develop the whole area of life scripts. Up until the time that he developed life scripts, he would continue to use analysis, psychoanalysis. He would help people through using TA get into an okay place, and then if they wanted to understand their early influences on them and so forth, he would put them into analysis. Once he began to develop life script analysis, he stopped using psychoanalysis for the most part and simply used the life script work. I want to also just mention some of the major books by Byrne. The first book was The Layman's Guide to Psychiatry and Psychoanalysis, which was first published in 1947. It was published under the title of The Mind in Action. The title was later changed in a republishing of that book. His first book on transactional analysis was Transactional Analysis and Psychotherapy, which was published in 1961. Probably his most popular book was published in 1964, Games People Play, which has been translated into almost every possible language worldwide. And it's still, you will see it on in airports and bookstores and so forth. It still continues to be a popular book until today. His first book on organizations and groups was The Structure and Dynamics of Organizations and Groups, which was published in 1966. And then he also published a book on Principles of Group Treatment, which was also published in 1966. In 1970, he published a book called Sex and Human Loving, which was not a great book on sex, but it's a very humorous book, and a book that contained some new ideas on transactional analysis. It was originally written as a series of lectures for Stanford medical students. And it contains a lot of Byrne's very dry British wit. His opening line is, "Sex is wet." And then he goes on from there. So it really is a nice example of his humor. His first book on scripts was What Do You Say After You Say Hello, which was published actually after his death. He was working on the manuscript of that book when he died in 1970. And Jack Doucet, who also was one of his students, who's a psychiatrist here in San Francisco, put together his manuscript and published it under the title of What Do You Say After You Say Hello. And a book that, excuse me, a book that Claude Steiner wrote, in 1976, was a collection of Burns' writings. Excuse me. I've got a slight cold, so I'm having a little problem with that. Let me get a lozenge. So Steiner basically drew together a number of Burns' writings from different sources on his work on games and scripts, and published a compilation of those writings in 1976 under the title of Beyond Games and Scripts. And then Paul McCormick, excuse me, go ahead.
Was that Jack Doucet or Claude Steiner? Beyond Games and Scripts?
I think it was Claude Steiner who did that. Jack Doucet did pull together his work on, what do you say after you say hello? But I think Steiner published the book on Beyond Games and Scripts.
The title, what do you say after you say hello, was a decision of Doucet or Verne?
No, that had been Burns' original title.
Oh, okay.
All right. Sorry about that. I'd also like to mention some books by other authors. One of the things that was kind of missing in the TA literature was a basic textbook that could be used for training in terms of covering the basic one-on-one theory. So in 1987, Ian Stewart, who is from Nottingham, England, and I wrote a book called TA Today. It's now in its second edition, which was published in 2006, I believe. It's bad when you can't remember your own publication date, but it was recently updated in a second edition, and follows basically the theory that we are covering in this course, plus some additional information that we added in the last edition. Yes?
Yeah. You know this book in Spanish. In how many languages has been translated?
The last count, it was about 12 to 15. Yeah. Ian Stewart and I also wrote a book on personality adaptations, which was published in 2002, which looks at the different types of personality styles that we developed based on our early decisions and early interactions and conclusions about how best to survive in the world and meet the expectations of the big folks around us. Before we have rational cognitive abilities, essentially in the first 6 to 8 years, first 6 years of life, we rely pretty much on our feelings and intuitions to make decisions out of the world. Who we are, who other people are, what the world is all about, and what will eventually happen to a person like us. So if we have parents who neglect us and don't pay attention to us, or who are abusive to us, we may decide I'm basically unlovable, or they don't care about me, or the world is, if I'm abused, the world is a dangerous place. All kinds of early decisions that are based on our feelings and intuition, rather than having the rational information about the world. And we shape our personality based on those early conclusions. Claude Steiner's book, Scripts People Live, is the other major book on life scripts. That was written in 1974 and is really an excellent book in terms of understanding the basic concepts of life scripts. Robert and Mary Goulding's book, Changing Lives Through Redecision Therapy, is an excellent book on the application of transactional analysis integrated with Gestalt therapy. The Gouldings trained with both Fritz Perls and Eric Berne, and interestingly enough, Perls and Berne died within a month of each other in the summer of 1970. After their death, the Gouldings began to put together the best of both approaches. They saw what an excellent integration these two models provided, with TA being such an excellent, clear conceptual framework, and Gestalt being such a powerful set of experiential techniques. So while Perl and Burns were alive, they kept inviting them over for dinner and trying to get them to talk about how their theories might be integrated. And Perls and Berne both had been kind of mavericks who had developed their own approach in reaction to psychoanalytic work, and they weren't about to integrate their theories with somebody else. So after their death, I think the Gouldings really put together the best of both approaches into what they call redecision therapy. And then Muriel James in 1977 wrote a book called Techniques in Transactional Analysis, which is an excellent example of some of the different techniques that have been developed in working with people in TA. There are many other books, many later books that have been published by a number of people in England and other parts of the world that are really excellent. These are some of the basic texts that I would start out with, and then look at the others as you go. So let me give you a definition of transactional analysis. Transactional analysis is both a theory of personality and human interaction, and a method that is used in psychotherapy, counseling, organizational analysis, and educational facilitation. You can be trained in each of these areas. Berne originally called his work social psychiatry. He said you don't need a lot of in-depth analysis to understand what is going on with people. If you simply observe how people present themselves and interact with others, you can discover a tremendous amount of information about people. And so he immediately began to see the application of the theory that he had developed, not only in working with people in therapy, but also organizations, education, counseling. And so he developed training in all of those areas, and his later followers developed certification processes in each of these areas. So you can be certified as a certified transactional analyst in the organizational field, in the educational field, counseling, psychotherapy, so on. Transactional analysis is made up of 4 basic parts. The first is called structural analysis, and that is looking at how the personality is structured in terms of ego states and how those ego states function intrapsychically as well as interpersonally with other people. A second major area is what is called transactional analysis proper. Given the fact that each of us have 3 ego states, TA proper looks at how communication either takes place or doesn't take place or takes place on more than one level, on what Byrne called the social level and also the psychological level, or the implied message that the person is communicating. For example, if somebody comes in late and I say, what time is it? What am I really saying? You're late. Right. I'm not really asking a question. The third major area is called life script analysis. And that really looks at what we do with our transactions over time with other people, how we tend to live out our life, based on a plan that we developed very early in childhood, often that we're not aware of. And the importance of life script analysis is to bring that plan into awareness so that then we can have choice over what we're doing and not just follow an unconscious plan. And then the final area that we'll be looking at is what is called game and racket analysis. These are basically ways that people use to justify their script and make the external world congruent with their life script. And they also offer substitute ways of getting recognition and attention, as we'll look at when we look at more depth at those areas. Byrne was very concerned about values in terms of psychotherapy, and he talked about the major criteria for a good psychotherapy is it should reduce the infant birth mortality rate. That it should have that kind of social impact. And he had 3 very important philosophical assumptions that he emphasized. One is that human beings are okay. What that means is each of us have basic worth, value, and dignity as human beings. That statement has been picked up by the popular media and really misunderstood a lot, and that people often assume that refers to behavior. It's not about behavior, it's about our basic essence as human beings. A friend of mine used to state it as, I'm okay, you're okay, bastards though we may be. That is, we may be acting in very inappropriate ways, but we have the potential to act very different. Our basic essence is fundamentally okay, and that of other people as well. And hopefully one day the world will get that, understand that. It's really sad when you look at what's happening in the Middle East and how much devaluing of human life is going on in the world currently. A second basic philosophical principle that Byrne believed in is that everybody has the capacity to think. We all have a fully developed adult ego state, unless severely brain damaged. And even people who have brain damage often have far more capacity to think and make good decisions than they're frequently given credit for. Because everyone has the capacity to think, then the third basic principle comes into play, that dysfunctional behavior results from early decisions made in childhood that at the time are the very best option the child has available for taking care of him or herself in the family that they grew up in. And these decisions that worked very well in childhood often limit ourselves in the present and can be redecided. An example would be if you grew up in a family where parents didn't know what to do with feelings, so they just tried to suppress them, and they criticized you or punished you or whatever, reacted negatively to your having feelings. You may have decided not to feel, which served you well in that family. But as an adult, it is our feelings that let us know what our needs are and motivate us to take action to get our needs met. And if you don't allow yourself to feel, you don't know what you need, and you're not motivated to take action to get those met. There are numerous other decisions that work for us early in childhood but get in our way as adults. Like if you grow up with people who are abusive, you may decide not to get close, which protects you. But in adulthood, that gets in the way of having intimate relationships with other people. So it's very important that we know that we have this capacity, that a lot of our behavior is based on very early decisions that we made that we're no longer aware of, and those can be redecided in the present. We can change those. The other important piece about knowing that everybody has the capacity to think is that it's really not up to the therapist or a consultant or counselor to decide what is best for us, because we are the only ones who will ultimately live with the consequences that we decide. So it's very important for us to make decisions about our own life and what we want for our lives and what we will do, because we are the ones who will experience the consequences. Any questions up to this point? Yes.
When you said that you're not supposed to get married when you're in analysis, can you explain that a little bit?
Well, psychoanalysis, one of the rules was to not make any major decisions, because in analysis you're working through very early issues and often into a lot of transference and countertransference reactions. And so it was sort of frowned upon for people to make any major life decisions like marriage or career or anything like that during the process of analysis. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm not sure if you're going to be talking about Byrne's childhood, but do you think that he had a good childhood and that impacted his theory, or do you think he had some difficulties and had to redecide?
I don't think anybody comes out of childhood not needing to redecide some issues. Byrne grew up in a Jewish ghetto in Montreal, Canada, and his father was a family doctor with whom he would go around and make house calls, which I think led to him becoming a physician himself. His mother was a very prolific writer that I think influenced Byrne in terms of writing so many books and articles himself. When he came to the United States, he changed his name from Eric Leonard Bernstein to a more neutral name, which was Eric Byrne. And I think it was because of some of the anti-Semitism he experienced growing up. So I think there were a number of things like that. I think the fact that he lost his father at such a young age, his father died, I think, when he was about 10 or 12. And so he basically grew up without a father during very formative years in terms of his adolescence. So I think there were a number of things like that that certainly influenced him that he had to deal with later on in his own work. Many people who knew him well in terms of his early career talked about that he loved to give parties because as a child he didn't get to experience much of a childhood, having lost his father at such an early age, and talked about him being a little socially awkward in terms of being at parties and stuff. But he sort of made up for that in terms of putting so much emphasis on the natural child and getting back in touch with that part of yourself. And so after his seminars, there would always be a party for people to get into their child ego state and enjoy themselves. Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, Vann, if you knew, obviously he's never taken the JPAQ, but what do you think Eric Berne's personality profile would look like?
That would be pure speculation, but from my experience of Berne, I think he certainly had some brilliant skeptic. I think he had some responsible workaholic, and I think he had some charming manipulator. Those would be my guesses. Possibly, but not very prevalent. Yeah, he may have had some traits. Right. It's kind of unfair to speculate about people after their death because you don't really have the evidence. But my impressions would be those. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about the first component of transactional analysis, which is called structural analysis. Looking at the component parts of the personality and how those parts function intrapsychically. To get an idea of this, I want you to just experiment with a simple exercise. And the exercise is simply to say your name in 3 ways. First of all, if you were one of your parents and you were introducing yourself as about an 8-year-old to the rest of the group here, how would you do that? For example, my mother, if she were here, would say, "This is my son, Vann Jr." Second, when you introduce yourself in current business situations, think about how you do that. For example, I say, "Hello, my name is Vann Joines. I'm president of the Southeast Institute in Chapel Hill, North Carolina." And then third, think about how you would say your name if you were about 8 years old, introducing yourself to a group of peers. For example, I might say, "Hi, I'm Vann." And as you do that, I want you just to pay attention to what you feel internally and what you notice about other people in terms of facial expressions, tone of voice, mannerisms, gestures, things like that. So, Catherine, are you willing to start and we'll just go around and have people do it? First of all, to say your name the way you would if you were one of your parents introducing you as about an 8-year-old to the rest of the group.
This is my third born. My father would say, "This is my third born, Catherine."
And how you introduce yourself in current business situations.
"Hi, I'm Catherine." And an 8-year-old?
Mm-hmm.
I would have run away. I was so shy as an 8-year-old, I would have, I would have avoided the scene.
Okay. Thank you.
My mother will say, "This is Tila, my first daughter, and she's very intelligent." And myself, I will say, "Oh, I am Tila, and I work at the university." And I really cannot remember. I was panicked to say who I was when I was a child.
Okay. Thank you. Next.
My parents would say, "This is little Tila. She's big Tilly." I would say I'm Dr. Leclerc, general surgeon. And when I was a child, I would say I'm Tila.
Good. Thank you.
As a child, as my parent would introduce me as, this is Sandy. Today I would introduce myself as Sandy Nisley. And as I look back, I would have introduced myself to everybody else as Sandy.
Okay.
My mother would say, "This is Tommy." And today I would say, "I'm Tom Nisley." And as an 8-year-old, I would have said, somewhat shyly, "No, I'm Tommy."
Okay, good. You want to do it?
My parents would probably distractedly say, "This is Tessa." I would say, "Hello, my name is Tessa." And as a kid, I would say, probably running around, "Hi, I'm Tessa."
Good. Good.
My father would say like, "This is Arundhati, my only daughter." Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My father would say, "This is Arundhati, my only daughter." As today, I would say I'm Aru Kadambi. As a kid, I would run away. I'm very shy.
Okay. A lot of shy kids there.
I think my mum would say, "This is Simone," and as a professional person, I would say, "My name is Simone Georgette Pesson. I'm a parenting educator at Early Years Parenting." And as an 8-year-old, I'd say, "Hi, I'm Simone."
Good.
Hello. My father would say, "This is my little Maria." I today would say, "Hello, I'm Maria. I'm a psychiatrist." And back at 8 years old, I would say, "Hi, I'm Maria."
Good. Okay, that's probably enough. I just wanted to give you a feel for that. Those of you who did that, what did you feel internally? Did you feel differently as you said your name in each of those ways? What are some of the things you experienced?
I sat up straighter when I was acting like my father.
Right.
And commenting about my birth order. And then when I was in my adult, it was more, "Hey, how you doing?" And as a child, really, I just would flee.
Yeah. Okay. Did you also notice differences in people's tone of voice and facial expressions, mannerisms, gestures, and so forth? Yeah. So these are the kinds of things that Byrne began to notice as he watched how people presented themselves and began to transact in groups of other folks. And what he began to see was that if we look at what Freud called the ego, or the self, the I, ego is a German word that simply means I, there are different states in which the ego is manifested at any given time. One is who we were as a child, our feelings, our feeling level reactions, intuition, the conclusions that we came to as a kid. A second is our ability to think rationally or cognitively that begins to be developed when we develop language. We don't have that facility until we begin to have symbols that we can use to have more, work with to have more objectivity. And that begins at about age 2 as kids begin to develop language. But that capacity is not fully developed until about 12 years of age. And we don't begin to use it very socially or actively until about 7. And that he called the adult ego state, the rational, cognitive part of ourselves. he also noticed that there are some messages and beliefs and so forth that initially looked like adult, but actually had more archaic sources and actually came from parents and other authority figures, which he then called the parent ego state. One of the first clients that he worked with was an attorney, a lawyer, who came in talking about the anxiety he would feel when he'd get up in front of a courtroom to defend a case. He said he would be looking and sounding like a very competent, self-assured lawyer, but internally he would be feeling very scared, like a little kid. And he said this really hit home to him one time when he went out on a dude ranch where he saw this little boy dressed up in a cowboy suit that was helping one of the hired hands. And at one point the hired hand turned to the little boy and said, "Way to go, cowpoke." And the little boy looked up and said, "I'm not really a cowpoke, I'm an 8-year-old. And he said that really struck him because that's exactly the way he felt in the courtroom. And as Byrne continued to work with other people, he began to notice that other people had these same states of personality. At times they would look like a very competent, grown-up adult. At other times they would look like a child and sound and act like a child. At other times he could see elements of the person's parent or other authority figures they had dealt with in childhood. So this is the model that he came up with, building on Federn's work. Federn, who said there are archaic states of the personality that are manifested in our current personality that are activated when we encounter some stimuli that's like something we experienced earlier. And Byrne categorized those in terms of parent ego states, adult ego states, and child ego states. It starts at about 2 when we develop language, about 2 years of age. The question was, do we develop adult at 7? What happens at 7 is we make a shift from primarily relying on our child ego state excuse me. So at 7, we stop relying as heavily on our child ego state and begin to deal with the world more from an adult perspective. That's why Freud called the period between 7 and 12 latency, because we begin to use more of the rational cognitive part of ourselves and begin to be curious about how things work and how to do things, and developing that capacity, which is more of an adult capacity. And again, by 12 years of age, that part of us is fully developed. So at 12, we have the potential to make as good a decisions as any grown-up. We don't yet have all the information programmed into the adult that we will have at later times that help us in that process. But in terms of information processing capacity, that's fully developed at 12. Yes?
When a child of maybe 4 is watching his mother make a salad for him, and then he says, "You didn't put in the cucumbers, but the cucumbers are over here." It seems to me that that's a thinking process.
Right.
An early adult.
Yeah, we begin to use that capacity from 2 on, but we don't rely on it primarily to make sense out of the world or operate in the world until about 7. Between 6 and 7, there's a radical shift. We give up the world of magic or fantasy and begin to deal with the world of reality, which is a major transition. That's why kids are so upset when they learn there's not a Santa Claus. That's a horrible realization, you know, that all those wonderful fantasies that we believed in are really not true.
Does Verne call this from 7 to 12 the plastic years?
Black?
Plastic.
Oh, plastic years.
Well, in Spanish, plásticos. In the book Hello, and there is a chapter of the plastic years from 6 to 12, I think. And well, my question is why plastic? I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't know.
term.
Maybe that's something in the translation, but I'm not familiar with that being called plastic.
Oh, okay.
Like moldable.
Oh, okay. Plastic in the sense of, yeah, very formidable, maybe. Yeah, malleable. Right, thanks. Good. We're going to be talking about how ego states develop in a minute. We're sort of getting ahead of ourselves, so I'll talk more about it later. Yeah.
I'm curious about this as a parent as well as theoretically. Is there a good TA thought process on whether we should tell our children there is a Santa Claus? Should we create?
I think it's wonderful for kids to believe in Santa Claus and all other, you know, magical kinds of things. That, you know, it's very age appropriate when they're 3, 4, 5. But as they begin to use their adult and you know, around 6, they begin to differentiate between feelings and reality. And at that point, it's helpful for them to understand that just because something feels a certain way doesn't necessarily make it true in reality. For example, you know, kids at night will wake up screaming, believing there's a ghost under their bed. And it's helpful to, you know, help them look under their bed and see that's not true, even though it feels true. To begin to differentiate between feelings and reality. But prior to that time, fantasy is a way of developing a tremendous amount of creativity and very functional.
My concern is when they start to process information, they turn to the parent that lied to them. And they now process information such as, my mom lied to me.
Well, I think you can, as a parent, you can talk about how fun it is to believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and all those things. And, you know, they don't think the way adults think. So it's important not to impose adult thinking on children. For them, it's a wonderful, magical time and fun and enjoyable. And you can help them understand that all of those things are fun to believe in, but they're not really true in reality. And help them with making that transition that they're already doing. So I think what's important is what is age appropriate for the child. Okay. Byrne, this first diagram is called a first order structural diagram. Structure looks at component parts. It's like if you looked at an automobile engine and you said, here's the carburetor, here's the generator, here's the engine block. Be talking about component parts, that structure. The other way we look at the ego states is what is called descriptive or functional diagram, which looks at how those parts are operating. For example, with an automobile engine, you might say the engine is idling, it's racing, it's sputtering, it's cutting off. Those would be functions. So if we look at that same structure functionally, the parent can function either as in a nurturing way, the way mother and father and other authority figures were being when they were being loving, supportive, nurturing of us as kids. It can also function as a critical or limit-setting parent to set limits on our own behavior so we don't do things that are hurtful of ourselves or other people. And that part is often referred to as the critical or controlling parent. Now, these are not separate parts of the parent, they're just different functions. It's the whole parent is functioning either in a nurturing way, as mom or dad did at times, or a controlling way, as they did at times, when they were telling us not to run out in the street or things like that, that were important for our own well-being. The adult functions pretty much all the time as a kind of reality computer to take in information, to process that information, to calculate probabilities. If I do X, this is what's likely to happen versus if I do Y. And to give out information. It's very important to have that capacity to continue to update information we have so we don't become extinct like the dinosaurs. If we look at the child ego state, the child can function in a natural, free, spontaneous way. That part is referred to as the natural child or the free child. It's when we're just free to be ourselves and be spontaneous and do whatever without influence, a lot of influence from other people. The child can also function in an adapted way. Learning to take turns, to share toys, to not butt in line, things like that are important adaptations that we make in growing up in order to get along well with other people in society. Sometimes we are required to do things that really require us to inappropriately shut down our behavior, and that would be the negative part of the adapted child. For example, if we're excited and playing and having fun and somebody is in a foul mood and tell us to cut out all that racket, it kind of squelches that part of us, and we may have to adapt to that when there's really no reason why we couldn't be excited and having fun and so forth. It's just the other person is in a foul mood. So each of these ways of functioning can be either positive or negative. The nurturing parent can be genuinely nurturing, or it can be pseudo-nurturing. Oh, you poor dear, are you all feeling okay? And it can be overdone in a way that invites us to feel like a victim. The critical or controlling parent can be appropriate in terms of setting appropriate limits on our own behavior or not letting other people abuse us. Say, hold it, it's not okay for you to treat me that way. Or it can be overdone in terms of people telling us that we're stupid or, other critical messages like that are really not true. The natural child, it's really fun and exciting to drive a motorcycle 100 miles an hour down the highway, but it's not very safe. So all that exuberance and spontaneity and joy needs some limits to keep us safe. That's why we have parents. And again, the adapted child can be appropriate in terms of learning to share, take turns, learn etiquette, things like that, or it can be overdone in terms of causing us to believe things about ourselves that are really dysfunctional, like that we're stupid or we're lazy or other things that sometimes parents might say to a child. So again, if we look at the child, it's the whole child that's functioning either in a free, natural way or in an adapted way. It's the whole parent that's functioning either in a nurturing way or a controlling way. Does that make sense to you? Any questions about that? Okay. So again, what Freud described as the ego or conscious part of the personality is made up of these three distinct states that represent essentially who the person was as a child, who the person is in the present, and also who the person's parents or other authority figures were that they internalized. And these are referred to as the child, adult, and parent ego states. And the definition that Byrne used for an ego state is it is a consistent, coherent system of feelings and thoughts, along with a correlated set of behavior patterns. So when we're in our parent ego state, we tend to look and sound and act like we saw mom and dad doing at a certain point in time. We tend to assume the same body posture, facial expressions, mannerisms, gestures, and so forth. For example, I remember one woman who whenever she would get in her parent ego state, she would step forward with her right foot, she would point her right index finger, she would furrow her brow, and she would talk down at the person she was talking to, kind of like that. One day somebody called that to her attention, and she said, "Wow, that's exactly the way my mother talked to me when I was a little girl." So unconsciously, she simply assumed the same posture, facial expressions, gestures, mannerisms, tone of voice that her mother assumed when she was being her parent. Another example is a little boy who was about 4, who was following his father into a garage. The garage door was about halfway open. So when the father went up to the garage door, he ducked down to go into the garage. The 4-year-old, for whom the garage door was about that tall, also ducked down when he went into a garage. Because what he saw was the way you enter a garage is to duck down first. He didn't know why. And a lot of information is internalized in our parent ego state in that fashion. We tend to do things because that's the way our parents did it, or the generation before us, or whatever. And we often don't stop and think about whether that's the most appropriate way to do something. And that's the importance of having an adult ego state with which we can update that kind of information in terms of what's most appropriate now. When we are in our parent, we often state messages the way we recorded them. Like a person might say, you just can't help feeling tired when you get home in the evening from a hard day's work. That's called a parent program. We're actually programming ourselves to feel tired by what we're telling ourselves. Some people feel excited when they get off work because now they can play and have fun. But if we believe we're supposed to feel a certain way in a certain context, we often program ourselves to feel that way. When people are in their adult ego state, they usually use the pronoun I and refer to some thinking, some rational cognitive process. And that's one of the ways you can tell the difference between the adult and the parent. When people go into parent, they will shift to second person pronoun, you. When people are in their child ego state, they use I, and they often refer to some feeling level process, like wish, want, can't, won't, don't want to, whatever. And their behavior is much more natural and spontaneous. For example, you were talking about how when you moved into your parent, Catherine, that you kind of straightened up. And that's the kind of body posture you'll sometimes see in the parent. More of a, standing the way, erect the way we were taught to stand. When people are in their adult, they stand in a more neutral way. When people are in their child, they slouch or sit with their feet up under them in the chair, or they're in a more relaxed, natural posture. and skip and do things like that, the way we did as a kid. So body posture, facial expressions, mannerisms, gestures, all of those things will be slightly different in the different ego states. I also want to talk about what's called a second-order structural diagram. If we look at, again, the ego states of parent, adult, and child, when we're referring to the grown-up ego states, the states of a grown-up person, we often use the subscript 2. Within our parent ego state, we have mother and father's parent, mother and father's adult, and mother and father's child. And I begin to use the subscript 3 to just differentiate them from the grown-up ego states of P2, A2, and C2. Byrne used to differentiate them by simply saying the parent in the parent, the adult in the parent, the child in the parent. But to just keep it consistent with the subscripts, I started using P3, A3, and C3. So these are literally mother and father's parent, adult, and child that we internalize into our own personality. Mother and father's parent might talk in slogans like a stitch in time saves 9. That would certainly be from probably one of our grandparents that the parents are repeating because they heard it as a child. The adult is kind of a in the parent is kind of a reference library for what has been true in the past. The child is the way mother and father felt and reacted to various situations. So we have all 3 parts of our parents and other authority figures that we have internalized into our own parent ego state. And we continue to do this unconsciously much of our lives. For example, the people that I initially trained with in TA were Bob and Mary Goulding. And I went out and spent 2 months with them in the summer of 1973. And when I got home, one of the things I was doing was twirling my right index finger a lot. And that was a characteristic gesture that the Gouldings would use to draw people out. And somebody asked me, do you know where the Gouldings got that? And I remember a videotape of Fritz Perls, and that was a characteristic gesture of Fritz Perls. So the Gouldings had picked it up from Fritz Perls, I picked it up from the Gouldings. And it works. I do my best therapy when I'm... So we often unconsciously pick up mannerisms and gestures and so forth from authority figures that we trained with or who've had influence on us, our mentors, in addition to what we pick up from our parents. Another thing I noticed was I would have certain inflections in my tone of voice when I'd be doing therapy. And then my supervisees would bring in tapes and I would hear that same inflection. And again, I probably got it from the Gouldings. My trainees got it from me. Often those things are just passed along generationally. Yes?
Because mother and father are so different, you have them both as mother and father P3.
Yes.
It's almost like I need 2 rows of P3, A3, and C3 in that same top circle.
Yes, that's a good awareness because we have literally probably 20 or 30 authority figures that we've internalized. Maybe more than that. But for sake of convenience, we lump them all together. In reality, there are lots of different structures from different authority figures. Yes?
All represented, generalized as the P3.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So,
as I'm understanding this, I may have maternal nurturing parent would be one P3. Maternal critical parent would be another P3. Paternal nurturing, another P3. So even one person could give me multiple P3s that I'm filing early decisions with.
Right. Yes. Right now we're talking about structure rather than function. But if we switch to function, that would be correct. If we look at the child ego state, well, I'll finish up with parent first. So P3 represents mother, father, other authority figures, parent ego state. The A2 is, or A3 is mother and father's adult ego state plus other authority figures. The same with child. The child is mother and father's child ego state plus other figures we may have internalized. The ego states that we operate with primarily between birth and about 6 to 8 are P1, A1, and C1. We will talk more about these as we go along, but essentially P1 is what I call the magical parent. It's the part of us that's in the magical thinking, who believes in fairy godmothers and witches and ogres and Santa Claus and all kinds of magical things. Byrne called this part the electrode. And the reason for that is this part often has programs about what we have to do at a, in a certain situation to survive. And he talked about it as once we have made those decisions, it's like plugging in an electrode. The behavior is automatic. And I didn't like that analogy because it was so mechanical. So I like to talk about that in terms of more of its function. That's the part that's really into magical thinking and has the fantasy that if I do X, the whole world will love me and adore me. If I do Y, the whole world will hate me and never want to have anything to do with me. And there are lots of grandiose fantasies or notions in P1 like that. And it's all based on what the child has felt and decided at some point, rather than actual fact. Yeah. The injunctions result in those decisions. The injunctions are the psychological level messages from our parents. For example, injunctions we'll talk about later in more depth, but just to give you an idea about them since they've been mentioned. Injunctions are the implied messages from mother and father's child that we often internalize. For example, if they had an unwanted child and they said something to me like, if it weren't for you, I could have gone to graduate school. I might decide that they would be happier if I weren't around. So the injunction I got was don't be, and often the child will make a decision that's consistent with that in terms of how they're going to operate in the world. But we'll get more into that as we go along. Let's get it on the microphone so we can hear.
World hates me or my coworkers don't like me. Is this a grandiose...
Right. That are all based on early experiences.
And it's not real.
That's right.
Everybody cannot hate you, right?
That's right. The adult is what Byrne called the little professor, the ingenious, creative part of the child that's making decisions based on intuition. And that part is very clever and very good at psyching out other people, reading people, and coming to conclusions based on all kinds of intuitive clues. And really a fun part of the personality. It's where most of our creativity comes from. The child in the child C1 is what Byrne referred to as the infant. Our basic wants and needs and feelings as a child. So if we look at the personality structurally, we have all these different component parts. And I think it's about time for a break, so after the break we will talk about how this whole structure develops.